welcome to Cafe 229. I'm your host today. I'm Joanne Chang, and it is amazing to have Dr. Deborah Middleton to be our speaker tonight, and she will introduce herself. So let me pass the baton to her right now.
Thank you, Joanne. I'm honored to be here and very grateful for the invitation. I'm also grateful to everybody out there tonight for your presence and interest. Deborah Middleton, I also write under the name Deborah Templeton. I'm based at the University of Huddersfield in the UK, where I lead a research project on performance and mindfulness. That project explores relationships between theatrical performance, also music and dance, and mindfulness, but also meditation more broadly. My own artistic practice is as a writer, and I have a particular fascination for the ways in which meditation and writing can support each other. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about mindfulness through the lens of the contemplative arts. I'll be drawing on examples of performance as practices of mindfulness in action. I'll also be considering how mindfulness leads to the cultivation of compassion, and asking whether the arts could be a vehicle for awakening our hearts. So, the inevitable question, what is mindfulness? Depending upon who is talking, the word mindfulness might denote a quality cultivated in meditation, a beginning stage on the meditative journey, a particular standalone technique, or the awareness that emerges from any of these approaches. Mindfulness is frequently described as a way of paying attention. It is also remembering to pay attention and remembering why to pay attention. Crucially, it is paying attention without judgment. And this means not only the good-bad kind of judgment, I like this, I don't like that, although suspending this is very important, but also the this-that kind of judgment, the labeling, the categorizing, the turning of living experiences into static concepts. In bringing non-judgmental awareness to the present moment, we are already stepping away from the discursiveness and discrimination of the everyday mind. In daily life, we tend to overuse a particular form of mental activity to the detriment of other capacities that we have. We're very adept at verbal reasoning, even when we are not reasonable, and running linear, logical, left brain thought processes, even if they are often illogical. Many of us have a tendency towards what actors call being in our heads. When an actor is in her head, she is wooden, unspontaneous, too caught up in thinking to be able to act freely. If we live our lives in our heads, we too tend to hamper our own responsivity, creativity, and capacity for action by overthinking, by dictating and directing our lives with constant side commentary and unnecessary narrative. Mindfulness is a break from all that. When we pay attention in the present moment, we are inviting a cessation of inner talking. A quietening occurs in order that we can tune in to what is arising in the moment and inviting our response. Without mindfulness, we may not even hear what is being asked of us. The composer, Philip Glass, says, "The problem with listening, of course, is that we don't. There's too much noise going on in our heads, so we never hear anything. The inner conversation simply never stops. It can be our voice or whatever voices we want to supply, but it's a constant racket. In the same way, we don't see, and in the same way, we don't feel, we don't touch, we don't taste." Mindfulness is always mindful of the experience of the moment. And that experience involves both the inner world of sensation, emotion, thought, and the outer world as it appears to our senses. Mindfulness of the moment is mindfulness of the body, and the body is a portal to the world, since the body is the domain of the sense portals. Everything comes to us through the body, and yet for much of our time, we go around like disembodied people, as though our whole world were only the fishbowl of our heads, as though our thoughts and reactions were the world itself. At least, I do. In Dubliners, James Joyce describes Mr. Duffy, a fellow who lived at a little distance from his body. Many of us might relate to this, either as a chronic condition, or one that appears in times of stress, or as a result of too much screen time. That disembodiment seems endemic to much of the contemporary world. But it can be balanced out on a daily basis by a deliberate strategy of returning awareness to the body through yoga, or Tai Chi, or meditation, through mindfulness. Mindfulness practices often begin with paying attention to the breath, that constant companion, the golden thread of our life that goes on with or without our attention. The breath belongs to the autonomic nervous system. It is an aspect of our organism that does not require our interference. But the breath is also amenable to our conscious interventions. We can decide to breathe in a particular pattern, as in yoga, or we can simply observe the breath as it flows in and out. You could do that right now. Just noticing, without judgment. Perhaps you can sustain a gentle awareness of the breath even while you are listening to me, because mindfulness also entails this kind of dual, in fact, multiple attention. It is usual to say, I am breathing, but the I, as we commonly understand it, does not do the breathing. Perhaps, if you don't interfere with it, you might find that the breathing is doing you. When you turn your attention to the breath in this way, you might discover a living flow that you don't control, an exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide with the world around you, an exchange that sometimes can even seem to dissolve the boundaries between you and not you. This exchange can become a wonderful source of inspiration, to inspire, to breathe in. If you breathe with awareness, the breath can be a bridge between your inner depths and the outer world, a bridge that you can live on. Imagine that you are standing, breathing in front of a tree. You are inhaling the breath of the tree. Mindful of your breath in an encounter with a tree, your awareness flows on the breath and mingles with tree breath, with tree. Wordlessly, you enter into relationship with the tree. You show up for the tree and find that the tree is already showing up for you. In one of my poems, written as part of a contemplative performance that took place in a forest, I use the phrase, a duet of aspirated necessities. A duet. We are always in a duet with the world. Mindfulness is a way of noticing that. It is a process of stepping close in to the things in our lives so that we can know them. Know them as one would know a dear friend or a lover. This is quite different from knowing about something, having information. Mindful knowing is the knowing of the artist who draws closer and closer to the bamboo in order to know bamboo from its own side, in order to paint from that intimacy. According to Buddhist scholar Bhikkhu Bodhi, mindfulness entails close, repetitive observation of an object. This is a process of minimizing the distancing effects of all that conceptualization, the discriminating, labeling, categorizing activity we do all the time. If we slow down, come to our senses, and make the effort over and over again to abandon the thoughts that come compulsively between us and our lives, sometimes the objects of our attention flower into focus. It is as if we wake up from our disembodied dream, our incessant, abstracted thought stream. Mindfulness can be seen as a process of waking up. In his book on art as contemplative practice, Michael Franklin notes that aesthetic experiences have unusual power to awaken awareness. Art can play a role in our journey into wakefulness. The Vietnamese monk and teacher Thich Nhat Hanh beautifully expresses the results of mindful awareness in his writings. In the short text, Interbeing, he tells us, if you are a poet, you will clearly see this sheet of paper. Without a cloud, there will be no rain. Without rain, the trees cannot grow. And without trees, we cannot make paper. The cloud is essential for the paper to exist. If the cloud is not there, the sheet of paper cannot be there either. So we can say that the cloud and the paper inter-are. I like that the monk ascribes this way of seeing to the poet. It is the poet's work to see clearly, lucidly, to create the imagery that allows us to see past surface reality, to understand invisible dimensions. Mindfulness is the process by which the poet can gain this kind of insight. And if you are a poet, professional or amateur, you can develop mindfulness in action through your engagement with and expression of the things of your own life. One way that you could start to explore this basic idea is through free writing. Buddhist writing teacher Natalie Goldberg teaches a process of generating a free flow of unplanned, unedited, uncensored writing by keeping your hand moving constantly for a timed period. If you loosen up and relax into it, free writing can be a kind of meditation in which you see the movements of your own mind as thoughts and images spill out onto the page. You can ride the breath here too, dwelling on that airy bridge connecting inner and outer worlds. You can write from the ever-fertile space of their interaction. Sometimes, of course, mindfulness does not flower into vividness and lucidity in the way that I have been describing. Sometimes mindfulness puts us right in touch with our own stuckness, our compulsive thoughts, noise in the head, or the body presents as tense, uptight, restless, full of neuroses that won't let us be. As Franklin writes, through meditation and art, we learn how to observe the rising and falling of thoughts rather than contracting around them. we learn how to be with our own bodily discomfort and inner bad weather. Creativity teacher Julia Cameron offers a wonderful practice of morning pages. 3 pages of something very like Natalie Goldberg's free writing, first thing every morning. Cameron points out that this is not about deliberately trying to think something up, but rather about allowing something to emerge and getting it down on paper, like taking dictation. This requires the kind of receptivity that mindful awareness generates. And almost any art form can provide this space for cultivating self-awareness and the capacity to receive and accept whatever is arising. Mindfulness is a practice of tolerating discomfort, cultivating the ability to sit with, to sit through pain, irritation, uncertainty, the small and large sufferings that characterize this human life, without resistance or reactivity. Keats called this negative capability. When a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Negative capability is at the heart of creative as well as meditative training, because artistic work is full of mystery and uncertainty, and even more doubt. And irritably trying to get onto safe ground simply doesn't work. A creative practice, like a creative life, always involves traveling into the unknown. Sometimes, often, that discomfort is too much, and the mind leaps away, grabs a distraction, completely and utterly and conveniently forgets that we are in a mindfulness meditation. There is something more important. We must think about dinner, or about what happened yesterday, or enter into a long imaginary conversation with someone who is not there. If you have meditated, I'm pretty sure you will recognize this description. It is beyond commonplace. I believe there is a traditional description of the mind of the beginning meditator as being like a cascade, like a waterfall of thoughts, a deluge of words, noise, imagery, snatches of annoying songs. I once read of a meditator who went to a remote forest cabin on solitary retreat and sat in the mountain stillness by a babbling stream and heard marching bands. So strong was the impression that he even tried moving the boulders in the river, convinced that they were causing the water to create the sounds of the marching bands. Needless to say, moving the boulders did not help. So mindfulness is also a way of allowing us to find out by ourselves and for ourselves that moving boulders is not the answer. Changing the objects or the circumstances or the people in our lives does not, in the end, change what happens in our reactive little minds. Mindfulness practices can start to teach us about how we relate to the world and about the real cause of our suffering. I've said that mindfulness is a technique or practice, and also the state of being that the technique helps us to access. With repetition over time, mindfulness can even become a trait, a tendency, a characteristic way of being in the world. Since mindfulness is non-judgmental, accepting, equanimous, non-reactive, a person with trait mindfulness would be pretty nice to be around, even nicer to be. They might be what Robert Louis Stevenson was thinking of when he said, "Quiet minds cannot be perplexed or frightened, but go on in fortune or misfortune at their own private pace, like a clock during a thunderstorm." Unruffled, calm, steady, able to choose consciously rather than reactively. We can probably see why Jon Kabat-Zinn, a long-term meditator working at the Stress Reduction Clinic at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, would have had the idea that mindfulness could help his patients. These were people with chronic pain and terminal diagnoses. Mindfulness-based stress reduction would give them a means by which they could learn to be with pain, suffering, and fear with more equanimity, with less reactivity. They could begin to separate out the sensations of pain or fear from their reactions to those sensations. And this separating would provide a kind of breathing space, a place to rest, a way to accept what was happening and from there make creative choices. They could be solid old grandfather clocks in the very real storms of pain, fear, depression, despair. As some of you will be aware, there is much discussion and some criticism of the use of a meditational technique in this way. Even more criticism of the multiple commercial applications and offerings of mindfulness that have burgeoned on the back of popular presentations of the science of mindfulness that Kabat-Zinn's work sparked. There are reasonable concerns that mindfulness interventions are cultural appropriations torn out of their original contexts, reductions and distortions of mindfulness proper, possibly useful for relaxation, but lacking the essential attributes of mindfulness as it functions within meditation and Dharma contexts. Some say this is not the mindfulness of Buddhist texts and practices, but mindfulness light, or McMindfulness, as Ronald Purser calls it. Because in Buddhism, mindfulness is not an end in itself. Although its much publicized benefits, stress reduction, health, happiness, might be desirable, they're not technically the point. The point is the development of liberating insight and the transformation of our self-centered ignorance into the wisdom and compassion of a bodhisattva. Yet Kabat-Zinn saw his work, which was, after all, designed in the context of addressing suffering, as potentially opening into the Dharma more fully. He used the word mindfulness as a placeholder, but was actually bringing his patients into experiential contact with the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. And Tibetan teacher, Buddhist teacher and scholar, Reginald Ray, tells us that if we pursue mindfulness into its full depths, we arrive at insight. In fact, when we have fully abandoned our discursive thinking, we enter into a state of profound openness. In that state, with no discursive interference, liberating insight is naturally right there. In Buddhism, this state of being which mindfulness cultivates and from which insight naturally arises is sometimes called Buddha nature or basic goodness. And it is a state of being from which the naturally arising response is one of spacious acceptance and love. It is in this way that mindfulness can cultivate compassion. One way of understanding this is through the role embodiment plays in mindfulness. As my comments so far may have implied, mindfulness is in some ways actually about bodyfulness. Researchers have suggested that it is processes of embodiment enhancing the upflow of information from the body that explain the health-related benefits of mindfulness. And embodiment may also have a part to play in the cultivation of compassion. Instead of operating through the preconceptions and abstract conceptualizations and self-centeredness of the ego mind, mindfulness, followed to its natural development, puts us in touch with our own feeling states, with what the body knows, so that we are no longer blocking out the tightness in the chest that happens when we are mean, the churning in the stomach that accompanies a word of unkindness, the yearning in the heart that would move us to the compassionate act. And instead of blocking ourselves off from the world that is arriving to us through the senses, instead of being wooden and unspontaneous like the actor who is stuck in her head, we are able to be present with what is, and to respond spontaneously from a much deeper, more authentic aspect of our nature. Mindfulness activates a stream of embodied awareness that carries us out of our heads and into the heart of our own compassion. If actors know well the state of being stuck in the head, they also know something of how to release themselves from this state. And some teachers of acting and performance do this specifically through mindfulness-based processes. There is some evidence that the founding father of Western actor training, Konstantin Stanislavski, was himself influenced by Tibetan Buddhism, and he certainly engaged with and tried to incorporate what he understood about yoga. His emphasis on and approach to relaxation and concentration as foundations for the actor bear comparison with mindfulness techniques, and may have seeded the widespread use of at least some aspects of mindfulness in performance training. But there are clearer examples of specifically Buddhist mindfulness being explicitly incorporated into the actor's art. The Mexican theater director Nicolás Núñez has spent 40 years developing what he calls actor training dynamics. These are highly energetic sequences combining movement and visualization, and are all examples of mindfulness in movement. One of his key techniques is contemplative running, in which the runner relaxes in movement, maintains continual focus on their bodily experience, and abandons all thought of running to arrive anywhere. Contemplative running is often sustained for long periods of time, but with the right physical form, it's a little bit different to ordinary running, and the right mental attitude. Contemplative runners find themselves building rather than exhausting their energy. Núñez's mindfulness is directly informed by Buddhist meditation. He spent a year with the Tibetan Buddhist community in exile in Dharamsala, learning their performance traditions, amongst them a Vajrayana black hat dance. From this, he created what I consider his mindfulness in movement form par excellence. It's called Sitalalmina, and it's an hour-long practice incorporating the complex movement score of the black hat dance. The Dalai Lama himself gave Sitalalmina his blessing and recognized it as a tool for mental training. So a dance can be a mindfulness meditation. We can train our powers of concentration, develop inner strategies of non-judgment and acceptance, and dilate awareness through activating the upflow of sensory input through the body, even the dancing, whirling, energized body in movement. To be sure, not all dancing is mindful. I bet we've all done a bit of mindless dancing in our time. Not all running is contemplative running. In fact, many bodily disciplines are undertaken with strategies that are the opposite of mindful, taking our minds off the muscles that start to ache, imposing ego-based decisions and directions on the body, regardless that the body might know best, pushing beyond what is in favor of what we think it ought to be. I've said that mindfulness is really bodyfulness, but paradoxically, these bodyful techniques are crucially about what we do with our minds in the midst of the movement. In fact, mindfulness seems ultimately to be a process which brings about the integration and coordination of mind and body. The Japanese philosopher Yuasa Yasuo sees this coordination as the means by which the spirit or personality is developed and enhanced in traditional cultivation practices. Meditation is the key means by which we undertake this cultivation of the garden of our being, but as Yuasa explores, it can also be undertaken through artistic training. And he describes the resulting state of oneness of body-mind is characterized by the master actor on a stage. Mindfulness is often practiced in a solitary way, but in theatre, that most social and relational of the arts, there are also practices that could be described as interpersonal or relational mindfulness. In the field of mindful science, interpersonal mindfulness is a new and emerging construct. Thus far, it has largely been explored through parent-child or friendship dyads. Theatre practitioner John Britton has developed an ensemble training for performers called Self with Others. Through movement improvisations and the potentially chaotic context of a ball game in which multiple balls are thrown randomly between players in a circle, Britton trains performers to observe the subtleties of their ability to be in relation with others. Performers learn to listen to the sensory experience of their own bodies and to become attuned to their awareness of the other bodies, to their sensitivity to nonverbal cues. Self with Others is founded on a continual reassertion of non-judgment and acceptance. And the result is performers who are free to be wholly present to scene partners and audiences. Performers who can interact freely, spontaneously, in group improvisations that can seem as tightly choreographed as a school of fish or a flock of geese in ever-changing formation. Self with Others trains mindfulness through interaction and improvisation, because live theatre is interactive and also, even when scripted, essentially improvisatory. So is life. Mindfulness-based performance training, then, might offer us a way to develop interpersonal mindfulness in action, recognizing that the interpersonal domain can be one of the most challenging that we face. And audiences. What then of audiences? How might the mindfulness of the writer or performer affect the experience of the reader or the spectator? Is it possible to induce meditative or mindful states in an audience? What kind of theatre might we have if our intention was to generate mindful, aesthetic experiences that would be a path to compassion? This is something I have explored a little. In Clouds in the Cotton Weave, an interactive performance that I wrote as part of a project with sustainability researchers, I wanted to bring audiences into contemplation of the true cost and the true value of the simple cotton t-shirt as a way of raising consciousness around clothing purchase and disposal behaviors. It's an area of activity in which we have not yet as a society made good advances. Neither logical arguments nor emotive appeals seem to change people. We're too detached from our own disembodied cognitive processes. And when moved by emotion, we are too good at either avoiding the discomfort or feeling comforted by the emotional release of a good cry. Mindful or contemplative artistic communication potentially offers another domain of response by guiding audiences toward artistic contemplations that are neither ego-driven, discursive, and disembodied, nor sentimental, emotive, and reactive. Mindful aesthetic experience could be embodied, holistic, integrated, conscious, self-aware. Mindful aesthetic imagery would reveal unseen connections, inviting audiences to live the questions, as Rilke said, rather than jumping with Keats's irritability to premature or imbalanced conclusions. Mindfulness allows complexities, even apparent contradictions, to be present. It opens space for an embodied and embracing response to emerge. In Clouds in the Cotton Weave, audiences were actively involved in a participatory work which activated the senses. At the center of the experience was a meditation on the life cycle of a cotton t-shirt, which followed the model of Thich Nhat Hanh's Interbeing text that I read earlier. In that piece, Thich Nhat Hanh's clear seeing allowed us to see interconnection. The cloud and the paper inter-are, he told us. And through his eyes, we could see that too. As the text continues, we see not only the interbeing of the cloud and the paper, but the intrinsic necessary presence of the workers who interacted with the tree on its way to becoming paper. I'll read. If we continue to look, we can see the logger who cut the tree and brought it to the mill to be transformed into paper. And we see the wheat. We know that the logger cannot exist without his daily bread, and therefore the wheat that became his bread is also in this sheet of paper. And the logger's father and mother are in it too. When we look in this way, we see that without all of these things, this sheet of paper cannot exist. It is as if Thich Nhat Hanh's calm, abiding presence walks us toward these people, asks us to encounter them, and guided by him, faced defensiveness, by his loving acceptance, we can be present. And present, we notice what he shows us. We start to know that we need each other and that we are supported in a million unseen ways. When we see our interconnection, I believe that our compassion is naturally activated. And we can experience interconnection through the power of poetry to wake us to the unseen dimensions, or by breathing mindfully with a tree, or merging our awareness imaginatively with the bamboo, or by improvising in heightened synchronicity with an ensemble. The poetic image, as Thich Nhat Hanh implies, can help us to see beyond our usual confined perceptions. It can hold multiplicities. The poet David Whyte discusses the ability to create such an image. He says, in the poetic tradition, the primary imagination is the ability of the human being to form a central image inside of themselves that makes sense of all the 1,000 besieging images that they are surrounded by. And your ability to actually identify this internal focus, which holds all of these disparate foci out in the world, and the ability to put language to that internal focus, gives you an ability to belong, even to the most complex circumstances. We don't arrive at such an image, nor the poetry of words, paint, music, or movement that can express it, through the machinations of the ego mind. we enable the arising of such an image through a process of mindfulness. We could say that art as mindfulness in action is a process of activating the reservoirs of deep natural awareness that produce in us this quality of belonging to our lives, belonging compassionately to all their complex and challenging and often heartbreaking details. Mindful artistic process can be a way in which to touch and enact compassion. We can be artists of our own lives, blending mindfulness and creative action, bringing loving attention to each moment. And if we are brave, we can share our images, our dances, our songs of interconnection with others. Then, contemplative art can be a skillful means through which we help each other toward the profound, spacious, and liberating insights waiting in the depths of our embodied Buddha nature. Together, we can remember, over and over again, that no matter what is unfolding in the stormy weather of our lives, we belong. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Deb. As a performing artist myself, I find it very creative and very poetic sharing, and it's very helpful. I especially love the example about the cloud and the paper. It's something very unusual. We can connect those two things together, but with your explanation and example, it's wonderful to find ways to approach them. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So we'll start with our Q&A session right now. Thank you. Thank you so much, Deb. I do have a question for you on the website. Okay, so let me read to you here. Well, I'm a pianist, and you are a mindfulness practitioner and an actress, and also a researcher and writer. So I wanted to find out if which one did you find first, as a performing artist or as a mindfulness practitioner? How did you discover either, and which one comes first, or how they collaborate?
Okay, thank you. Well, actually, a little over 10 years ago, I was a theater academic, and I had a lot of interest in Buddhism. I had a meditation practice. I was studying Buddhism, but the two things were really very separate for me. And then, in fact, I stumbled upon contemplative education as it was being offered initially by Naropa University. And I was lucky enough to go to a summer school. And my initial thought was, wow, contemplative education for higher education is a way that I can bring Buddhism, which I love, together with my pedagogical practice, in fact. And so I managed to spend a sabbatical at Naropa, working with Lee Worley, who teaches a form called Mudra Space Awareness, which was developed by Trungpa. It's a theater form. And also I was doing a lot of meditation and yoga there. And I thought I was there to study contemplative pedagogy. But at the end of the sabbatical, I went up into the mountains with the intention to snowboard. And I just started to write creatively. And, I've always loved writing, but there I was, not being a writer in the world, but being a theater academic. And it seemed to me that period of time of deep immersion in meditation and this other meditation-based physical form that it really released something in me, so that my whatever had been stopping me just being a writer, it evaporated, and I kind of went up into the mountains and started writing. And you know what? I never snowboarded once on that trip. I just wrote and I kept writing, and it's led me from there. So yeah, that was my story. In fact, it was contemplative pedagogy that first allowed me to bring these things together.
Wow, a very special tool for you and for all of us, right? That's great. Okay, so I do have a couple more questions listed here. Personally, because I'm a performing artist, perform in the performing arts field, it's so competitive, and so there's you're working with mindfulness and acceptance, non-judgmental, but when it happens, you're working with other artists. For me, it's for collaborating with other musicians. For you, it's performing with in the theater, who may not share the same perspectives like we talked about mindfulness. So, and some of them would think criticism is such a key to improve, and to and the those judgments do show up from time to time. So, how do you maintain mindfulness in professional artistic context?
Right. Yeah, there can be a lot of ego there, right?
Yes.
We can find ourselves, swimming in seas of ego, others and our own.
Uh-huh.
Well, I would say that mindfulness, when it's seen in the context of Buddha Dharma or other kinds of spiritual systems, I think they help us to have a lot of context and to see mindfulness embedded in ethics, and there's a guidance there for the kinds of things that you're talking about. So mindfulness in itself can help us to be less reactive, to bring more awareness to our interactions, so we're perhaps not so kind of triggered by somebody else's way of interacting with us. Mm-hmm. But also from the Buddha Dharma more broadly, we can learn about sort of right speech and right action, and so forth. So I think it's a kind of a combination of developing one's own ability to stay centered and calm and aware and conscious in interactions, and also perhaps having access to some of those teachings that really teach us about wise, skillful ways of interacting with each other. And the other thing I think I would say is that, often when we go into those kind of collaborative spaces, nobody's going to make space for our mindfulness practices there. So we really do have to bring them in with us. We have to,
definitely
have those spaces in our own lives so that we can, to the best of our ability, embody our own spaciousness that allows us to perhaps negotiate a little bit more lightly and compassionately with others, something like that.
Yes, I enjoy the word compassion that you brought up here. I feel like it's a strike of balance between compassion and wisdom. Where do we have compassion for ourselves and for others, and understanding where they're coming from, but use the wisdom wisely to also improve our performances at the same time. So it's like a good balance right there.
Yeah. And Joanne, I think you said something really important there when you talk about compassion for ourselves, because I think that's where it has to start. And we see artists, don't we, all the time trying to sort of live in these competitive, ego-driven worlds, and it can be very damaging. In fact, I think they did some surveys of people in the performing arts in Britain. It came from Equity, so I guess it's actors, and performers of that kind. And there was really high levels of mental ill health in those communities.
Wow.
So I'm in touch with a number of people who are working on like mindfulness training for performers in different ways for this very reason, is the ways in which it can help us to develop self-compassion and resilience, really. Because those can be really, really tough worlds, and we can be very hard on ourselves if we haven't learned that ability to bring awareness and kindness to the whole creative process.
That is so true. It is 100%, 200% truth there. It's not a big field, but there's so many talents out there, and creating the space for everyone is always it's something that's challenging. So
Right.
that brings me to the next question here. That thinking of criticism and mental health, and that has maybe something to do with our spontaneity. In music, we talk about improvisation in jazz, but in your field, you also do a lot of spontaneous writing or performance. So, but you also want to talk about mindfulness, developing the ability to choose consciously. So, are those contradictory?
I don't think so. I think when we speak about, let's say that if we're talking about being spontaneous, let's say in creative acts, in improvisation, but it could be in anything in life, we want to, of course, make a difference between the kind of jumping into some kind of compulsive reactivity. So just jumping, just moving fast isn't really the kind of spontaneity that we're looking for and that we're talking about in the context of mindfulness. So that spontaneity is to do with responsivity arising, when we have that kind of, like, I guess we think of it in terms of inspiration, like the image, the movement, the moment kind of appears. But it appears in spaciousness, in a spaciousness that we have been able to create for ourselves through our practice. And it appears with our awareness. So when we're compulsive, when we're just sort of compelled to jump to something that doesn't have consciousness around it. And what we're talking about in mindfulness is creating the space of awareness. So I would say on a good day, that in that kind of cultivated space, when something arises, although it can seem very seamless and fluid and temporally fast to an observer, for the practitioner, it's a moment of space, and it's still a choice. Something arises, I observe the stimuli, I observe the impulse, I make the choice to allow that impulse or not to allow that impulse. So I would say that kind of spontaneity is still about conscious choice, and the element of consciousness there that comes with my ability to observe myself in action, is the crucial part. Does that make sense?
Yes. It is something I think professional people need to work on and experience themselves. It's something that I feel it's more like understanding is one thing, and trying to executing it and getting it achieved, that's another different level as a professional.
Absolutely. And it's not easy. I'm not for a moment suggesting that these things are easy, but they're what we aspire to. Sometimes we have some moments.
Yes, definitely. That's very insightful. Very good. I have one more question here. I'm going to read this because it concerns about your writing. How does mindfulness relate to the part of creative practice, which is a follow-up of my previous question? That is about judgment. To the editing and conceptualizing discursive part, for example, a writing practice. how we can abandon discursive thinking and still write at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, because I think it's easy for us to think about mindfulness in the way that I talked about as a kind of, awareness and creation of space in which something wonderful arises, the kind of inspiration side of creativity. But of course, that's only like a very small part of creativity. And there is also this whole other much bigger territory, which is to do with, the exercise of the craft. And certainly in writing, it's to do with editing and analyzing and all of these kinds of things. So again, I would say that so of course that kind of discrimination, those kinds of artistic judgments are not the same as the negative judgments that would get in our way. They're just part of the craft. We make informed choices and decisions. So those things are different. And then also there's a difference, I would say, between engaging that kind of mental activity. So let's just imagine that we're talking about editing, writing, for example. That can be a very narrow and a very discursive and a very cerebral activity, which could sort of lead us into this kind of a tunnel where we lose the rest of our being. And I think again that the quality that mindfulness brings to that is awareness, and that's a kind of a global awareness. So yes, I may be having this kind of mental behavior, these mental activities, but I don't disconnect from the soma, I don't disconnect from my feeling sense, and I don't disconnect from those sort of more expansive aspects of mind. I think that we have like aspects of mind. I'm not a psychologist, so I don't have the language for it, but I think we can probably all think of times when our minds are spacious enough that we sort of tap into a bigger knowing than the one that we get if we're just too narrow and too pinpointed in our attention. And that actually maintaining access to that spacious mind that discerns the much bigger patterns, that makes connections, that can hold many things, including contradictions, at once. That's what I think makes the difference there. So yeah, we do have to use those cerebral, rational, logical, verbal aspects of mind, but we try to learn to do it in a way that doesn't sort of cut us off from the neck down.
Great.
Tolstoy used a really lovely word somewhere. If anybody's listening and they know where, I would like to know where, but I know that he talked about that writing could be brain spun, and the brain spun wasn't good. Brain spun was like contrived and cut off from any sort of deeper intuition, and not good. And I think what we're talking about here is, yeah, let's not narrow down to a bunch of ideas, being driven by ideas or driven by ego or by very narrow forms of mentation, but can we maintain this much more spacious and embracing consciousness?
That's great. Sounds like, again, it's like the practice opens up our mind and give us a bigger freedom and space for exploration. But meanwhile, we're still rooted down to earth about what we are writing and what we are thinking, right? Is that okay? All right.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Okay. That was really nicely said. Rooted is a lovely word for it. Yeah, we're still in contact. We're in contact with deeper levels of ourselves, in contact with the body, in contact with the earth, and being rooted like that is a really great way to think about it.
Wow, thank you so much. As a performing artist myself, and also I write mindfulness and practice mindfulness, this is such a helpful and very insightful speech. Thank you so much, Deb. It
Oh,
is
that's
such an
great.
honor to have you tonight.
Thank you, Joanne. It's been really wonderful to be here. I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to be part of this series. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Deb. So a little bit of advertisement for our next speaker on our webinar in October. Dr. Randai Sample, who is an associate professor of clinical psychiatry and behavioral science department at Keck School of Medicine of USC, University of South California, will be sharing her expertise in the mindfulness with children. And so any family members who has any kids and who wants to introduce mindfulness to your children, please come back to us. Thank you so much for tonight sharing your time with us. I hope to see you next month. Take care, everyone.